we can now start.
Thank you, sir. Can I take us to page 442? And talking about functions, we're attracting, developing, owning and supporting major and strategic tourism events, and indeed there are some other functions before. Ensuring a coordinated approach to promoting South Australia is one of them. Can I confirm, is the Major Events Fund not in this portfolio? Is that the case, and if so, why?
Well, you're actually referencing 21-22. There was no reference to the Tourism Commission ordered by the Auditor General about the Major Events Fund. It's under the responsibility of the Premier.
Yes, and the question was in supplementary to that answer. Why?
The Auditor General didn't ask that question or involve himself in that question. Member, next question.
Well, can I make a point of clarification, sir? Am I allowed to ask a supplementary in relation to information provided by a Minister in an answer?
It doesn't have to be a supplementary. You can ask it as a question, but the question still has to be within the guidelines for the examination of the Auditor General's report.
I will take your wisdom, sir.
Because nobody else does.
Can I ask then, in relation to ensuring a coordinated approach to promoting South Australia, which was identified certainly by the Auditor General as the functional responsibility of the South Australian Tourism Commission, does that remain one of the functional responsibilities of the South Australian Tourism Commission?
Your specific thing is about coordinating an approach, a coordinated approach. So one of the key things for the SA Tourism Commission, which remains and has remained, whether it be 21 or 22 or now, is particularly our focus around destination marketing. And that's always been a key part that we've done, and that remains a key coordinated focus of the SATC, as it did in the year that we refer to with the Auditor General. That coordinated approach is about how we market ourselves to the world, and that hasn't changed. And in fact, although I don't wish to speak about 22, 23, it was raised with us that it needed more support, and that was seen to be there. Obviously, we are currently running, May 2021, the domestic advertising campaign A Little More was launched in South Australian key interstate markets. Now, of course, that was such a difficult time for us because we were facing border closures. The international market had ceased at that point, so we really needed to focus on South Australians enjoying their own backyard. That was a very coordinated approach. Even if I spoke from opposition, I think that we saw South Australians enjoying their backyard for the first time, realising how much we had to offer, and then when those interstate opportunities came, that marketing campaign went out there as well. So it's a very coordinated approach, and we will continue to lead that.
Thank you. Now, given that coordinated approach across the whole of government, has the SA Tourism Commission or indeed the Minister provided any briefing to the member for Mawson in his work promoting South Australia to the world on behalf of the government, either in the 21-22 financial year or any other?
The Auditor General made no reference to this, and we're focusing on 21-22.
The Auditor General, did I submit, Minister, make reference to the responsibility of the Tourism Commission in the Minister's portfolio for having a coordinated approach to promoting South Australia, and I'm seeking to establish if that has taken place?
Yes.
On what dates was that briefing provided to the member for Mawson?
My answer is yes to a coordinated approach, but there is no reference here to 21-22 and no reference to the member for Mawson here. The coordinated approach as destination development continues and will continue as it did in 21-22.
Can I clarify that the coordinated approach in 21-22, did that reference major events?
Well, I think when I think about a coordinated approach, I think specifically around marketing and how we market our state to South Australians, interstate and of course internationally. And that's what was done and what continues to be done. The Auditor General made no reflection on this except to say that was the role of SATC and that continues to be the role of SATC.
Can I turn the Minister's attention to the next line, which is on the first line of page 442, where the Auditor-General identifies part of the Tourism Commission's role as to being attracting, developing, owning and supporting major and strategic tourism events. Is that no longer the role of the Tourism Commission?
The Tourism Commission still plays an incredibly strong role in this area. In fact, we're very, very excited about the Santa's Tour Down Under coming back in its traditional format. But of course, we recognise in the year that we're talking about, 21-22, there was a lot of leadership that was required to do it, as I call the Festival of Cycling, if I recall accurately. And of course, when we look at some of those areas that we took leadership on, Tasting Australia is one of the key things that was produced in South Australia that we own. And that was an exceptional year. When I look at April 2022, in fact, the very kind of high-end opportunities where we had this Tasting Australia Air that came out, and that was supported by RAA Travel. I think they were sold out, if I recall accurately. So that went off to 6 or so different destinations. And 150 local businesses were utilised, and of course the Town Square Kitchen as well. Now, of course, just next week we had the Christmas pageant. For 2 years it was a ticketed event at the Adelaide Oval to deal with COVID. And of course these are the events that we continue to, and that's not to underestimate all the other events we sponsor, whether it be WOMAD or the Adelaide International. So the role of SATC in managing events is still incredibly strong. And that is a key part of what we have done in 21-22, and I see that we'll continue to do that for the future. SATC is still the lead here, and we have incredible talent, incredible depth for managing those events, and South Australians love these events, and we continue to do so.
Is the Minister able to provide a list of the events that are identified referenced in this dot point? The events that are described as, I think by the Minister, as owned by the state government, but I could stand to be mistaken. Certainly the ones that are identified as major and strategic tourism events by the Auditor General.
I did detail the significant ones, but I'm happy to take that on notice to provide that detail.
And can the Minister identify if there are any of those events that are no longer to be considered under the domain of the SA Tourism Commission or indeed the tourism portfolio going forward?
I think those questions would have been best asked to the Premier, and he was on yesterday.
Can I take us to... Actually, no, can I ask about the next dot point? Developing tourism resources to maintain and preserve South Australia's environmental and cultural heritage. Is the Minister able to reflect a bit on what that cultural heritage is in relation to the tourism offering that we are able to provide to the world?
Just last week I held an amazing dinner with leaders from our Aboriginal community. So when we think about our Indigenous cultural heritage, that continues. As far as what happened in 21-22, I couldn't talk about at this point. Obviously, the member for Dunstan, the former Premier, was the Minister for Tourism. But if there's one thing that I see, and we just recently held a National Tourism Ministers meeting here, I was happy to co-host that with the Federal Minister for Tourism. Our absolute unique selling point in Australia is having the longest living culture on earth. And so I'm very interested in how we support our Indigenous tourism operators. Recently there was an event at the Circle down at Lot 14, and they have been supporting Aboriginal businesses to establish and develop, and I'm very keen to keep talking with them and seeing how they can work with supporting tourism industry. The Tourism Industry Council of SA has indicated they're interested in providing support for an Indigenous Tourism Operators Alliance. We've been quite influenced by what's happened in Western Australia who are seen to be quite the leaders in this world. We're really keen to walk alongside people as they establish their businesses. What I did hear from people, and I guess when we talk about cultural, is authenticity and Aboriginal people speaking the stories that are their own. That's incredibly important to them. And how do we make sure that we're supporting Indigenous corporations? So we're currently working on an Aboriginal tourism strategy. It has been in development for some time. Personally, I'm interested in very practical support for people as they build their businesses. I think the Ghana Living Centre came to see us, and it's something they connect well. We know that when people come off the cruise ships particularly, they're very interested in what they can see here. And so that cultural heritage continues. But I really couldn't talk, apart from the development of that strategy that started last financial year, that's the key parts here. Also, of course, one of the other key things is, as part of the public service, the South Australian Tourism Commission is committed to the goals of the South Australian public sector to increase employment of Aboriginal people across the sector. As at the 30th of June 2022, one full-time equivalent is identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. That's obviously something that I would be keen to increase. And I think as we continue to talk to people, and there is a reconciliation plan that SATC looks at, and I think this is something incredibly important to us, very unique to Australia, but it needs support, and we'll be looking to do that.
Can I take us to the next page? It talks about income, sponsorship and participation income declined by $1.6 million, 30%. Is the Minister able to identify, do we expect that this income will recover in the future, or indeed in the current financial year?
My understanding is, as I'm advised, that COVID had a massive impact on those events. Recovery is going well, and we expect that that will bounce back to what it traditionally has been. Let me just take this opportunity to recognise that we're still building back post-COVID for tourism. Things are looking really good. We're at 6.2 billion of what we had reached a high of 8.1. Just this week, we welcomed in the cruise ships, 104 visits due this year. But we do still have some way to go. And so I guess one of the key things, as much as I've gone out there very positively, we saw some build-up last financial year, some positive from a low of what was 4.4 billion, but there is some way to go as well. And we also have had a lot of people exit the industry, and we have to encourage them back. So as we go out with those events and sponsorships, which you'll see reflected here, I think we'll see people come back to the industry.
Thank you. Can I take us back to page 441, and in particular the second dot point, which refers to the significant events and transactions. The Tourism Commission managed the 7th and 8th instalments of the $10 million Great State Voucher Program. This scheme will not be renewed in 2022-2023, according to the Auditor General. I've got a couple of questions on this one, so I'll just do them one at a time. Is the Minister able to outline the total value that the State Great Voucher scheme injected into the South Australian economy and flowed into the pockets of tourism operators and businesses?
There were 8 rounds of the Great State Voucher, and as I recall, sitting on your side of the House, we were a very big supporter of this. In fact, it was an incredibly important scheme. I was really pleased to advocate to not include just accommodation, but to also have experiences. And I continue to meet people as I go out and about as Minister for Tourism who said having the experience as a part of the Great State Vouchers was incredibly important to save their business. So that was good. We saw that the consumer spend for the Great State Vouchers was $148.6 million. That's over the 8 rounds. So that was over more than one financial year. I'd have to come back with the specifics for 21-22. But it was really important. There was, however, quite significant the rounds 7 and 8, and I did find that quite interesting, actually, about what that looked like. I have those details about how that was paid for. Round 7 and 8. So obviously that was right at the end, just before the election. And while obviously that has then seen some positivity about accommodation and bookings fact, it was a little bit different than the way it was funded, which was really interesting as Minister now. So what we actually saw, that there was a deficit then of our net result and total comprehensive result in 21-22. So that deficit was 10.5 million. So that was round 7 and 8 of those great state vouchers. So that's a budgeted deficit that was approved by the Department of Treasury and Finance. So if I recall, it wasn't allocated at all. It was from existing cash reserves. So that was quite interesting that that decision was made. So it wasn't appropriation, it was from existing cash reserves. So that has led to this net result with a deficit to us. But there's no doubt at all that those great state vouchers were really important. And what was important, you can look at the money, but what was important, and I've heard this again and again, it reminded South Australians that tourism and hospitality were doing it tougher and continue to do it tough. And that recognition and having those vouchers come out reminded people that they needed their support, particularly when JobKeeper ended. Now, that was devastating for tourism hospitality. So many businesses in South Australia did well out of COVID. But there are a group that really did it hard, and that was tourism and hospitality. And they continued to do it hard for quite some time. So those great state vouchers helped. With the return on investment was 5.9 to 1, so they worked quite well. But it was really important to me that they reminded South Australians that tourism and hospitality still needed their support.
And before the answer and confirmation of the significant positive benefit of the program, I'm interested in the comments she made about the budgeted deficit that Treasury approved in relation to the provision of rounds 7 and 8. Is the Minister expressing a concern about the government decision to provide rounds 7 and 8, or can I confirm that the Minister is supportive of the program as it was rolled out across the years that it was in existence?
I'm just simply making note of it.
Can the Minister advise, she became the Minister obviously in March this year, so for several months of the financial year under the report she was the Minister. Did the Minister have feedback from tourism operators since she's been the Minister prior to the 30th of June this year about the program and how it went?
Yes, I've already elaborated.
And can the Minister advise the House why she cut the program then?
So in coming to government, we were very clear that the great state vouchers were there to stimulate the economy. It was incredibly important at a time where tourism and hospitality were doing it tough. But what we needed to do was pivot, something tourism businesses had to do a lot of, and we needed to direct that support towards marketing. We made that very clear in the election policy that that's where the direction was going to go. And I think what we've seen is we've done well. We saw our CBD, the TF data said the CBD was the most active of all states in July of this year. So I stand by that decision. That decision was important to make, but I recognise that the great state vouchers played a significant role. And I'll recognise that, but now we're focusing on marketing. We know it's going to be competitive, and if there's anything I found from my tourism ministers meeting is that all of us cannot wait to have more visitors coming to our states, and so we need to make sure that we have that focus now of selling South Australia to the other states, to the world, and getting back to what was normal. And that's going to take focus, and we're prepared and focused on that.
I thank the Minister. Just in supplementary to that last question, prior to the return to what is normal, have tourism operators, potentially in the financial year that the Auditor General's report is limited to, raised with the Minister any desire to shut down the Great State Voucher Program?
I had many conversations with people prior to becoming the Minister and since becoming the Minister, and many of them are very keen for us to go back out and support and to market who we are. They recognise the role that they played. I don't recall any particular conversations that I've had that people have asked for the vouchers to go back. The only people I've seen that have asked was the opposition, who then we came out with great results in the CBD and the highest hotel occupancy we've had for some time, whether it be regional or CBD. So they played their role, and I recognise that. But now we're on to a new thing. It was very much a short-term stimulus to support an unprecedented event, a global pandemic. And that was very clear. I guess what I hear more and more from tourism operators is they are ready. They're excited. They really enjoyed having South Australians come and enjoy the regions. They've seen the interstate guests come, and where we had great events like the rugby, where we had 8,000 people from interstate. Now we've got the cricket on. At the moment, 40% of the tickets are for interstate and overseas. They just want to get back to business as it is, and they recognise that the vouchers played a role, but really they want to make sure we're getting out there and selling South Australia.
Thank the Minister. The next line talks about the $20 million Tourism Industry Development Fund. Can the Minister outline the total visitor expenditure that's been generated by this fund?
The Tourism Industry Development Fund was fully allocated in early 2022, with 114 projects receiving funding across all 11 tourism regions. It did take some time, I think longer than people expected, for those tourism projects to run out. We know construction costs have gone up. We know that sometimes it's been hard to get people in to finish those construction projects. The project was a value of $82.7 million. And of the last financial year, 62 of those 114 projects were completed or near completion. And those projects roll out, and we'll be talking about it this time next year. But once again, we're looking at a stimulus that was provided due to the global pandemic of COVID. And I think that we've seen that continue to roll out, and that will be a benefit for the future.
I think the Minister identified it was 114 projects, or maybe I read that. How many of those projects have now been completed?
21, 22, I answered that question.
Comments before, was it? Thank you. So is that 62 overall, or 62 that were completed in that financial year, noting that the funding was all provided before the end of June?
62 out of the 114 projects were completed or near completion on the 30th of June 2022. If I remember correctly, 61 of those 62 projects were funded in 21-22, and one was funded in 2021. We would expect the completion of those this financial year.
Can I, I'm going to just ask one or two more questions in this area, and then we might find a little bit of time for our friends from DPC. So can I ask, on page 442, the findings of the audit were communicated in a management letter to the Chief Executive. Can the Minister confirm whether we were talking about the old Chief Executive, the interim Chief Executive, or the new Chief Executive? To whom was that letter sent?
I'm really glad you mentioned our incoming Chief Executive. What an exciting announcement just recently. So Emma Terry will be joining us in the first week of January, or second week of January, I think, coming as the Director of Marketing, Executive Director of Marketing from Tourism Tasmania. Very excited about that appointment. But I cannot say that without recognising what a wonderful acting CEO Stephanie Rozakos has been, and I really appreciate her advice and the steady roll of the ship as we await our new CEO. But yes, as I understand it, on the 30th of June 2022, Rodney Harricks was the CEO.
Can the Minister identify why Mr Harricks ceased to be the CEO?
I don't see any reference to that.
And given the time, we'll move to multicultural affairs. I'm sure we could have spent 5 minutes talking about that, but let's not. So page 339, I think, is probably the best reference. Can I confirm with the Minister, as the advisors are changing over, the multicultural grants in this area? Is this the line through which funding to community language schools is being delivered?
Well, as this results or relates to 21-22, then at the moment I can go through our current grant program for 21-22, which is Advanced Together, which is supporting multicultural organisations to improve their governance and strengthen their capacity.
In relation to community language schools, so if this isn't the budget line, then I might suggest a different budget line perhaps. Thank you, Minister. Maybe page 71, is the Minister able to identify if she is responsible for the delivery of the community language schools funding that in 2021-22 appears to have come from the Department for Education?
In 21-22, that is correct. And perhaps I could clarify, that funding will continue to come from the Education Department. The additional funding, as announced in the election policy, in fact, the key part of the multicultural policy that we put out, so disappointing to see that the opposition didn't put out a multicultural policy at all, but and actually it was raised with me and continues to be raised with me quite often, that 1/4...
Minister, there's a point of order. Sorry, relevance?
Relevance to the question, sir.
Look, I think the Minister's providing some context, and this is a relaxed atmosphere. She can answer in any way she sees fit within the bounds of the Auditor General's report.
1/4, $4 million over 4 years of the additional funding for multicultural affairs will be directed to the community language schools. However, the Education Department will remain the key funder of this sector, and that relationship will continue.
So to confirm, is that $4 million the responsibility of the Minister for Education and
Oh, yeah.
So that $4 million is part of DPC or Education?
DPC.
And then provided to Education in the form of grants, or through Education from DPC to the Community Language Schools Association to the school? Can the Minister explain?
So one of the challenges we had looking at a multicultural lens at community language schools, which was raised to me, and I would suggest perhaps raised to you, Member for Murray-Alta, is the venue and locations, the cost and access and funding, the teachers, maintaining quality standards, student behavioural issues, accessibility to training, supporting what is mostly volunteers in this community language schools, increased costs due to COVID, sourcing materials including books and IT and furniture, and of course the registration process. We have 98 community languages school here in South Australia teaching 48 languages. The Community Languages School of South Australia registers the schools and also provides training for people to go there. There's also concerns around the registration process, which is quite complex and time intensive. There's also a drop-off of engagement of older students. So these are issues that were raised. So while I recognise that the Education Department has done some great work, and under your leadership I understand the role with community language schools was something that was focused about how they could contribute, and I understand in the way that they are funded and distributed has changed in recent years. So we build on that and we look at what we can do. And I just announced recently, actually, the Year 1 priorities. So the first activity for Community Languages School in South Australia will be to develop and deliver a governance and compliance training package. And the training package will include assistance for schools to develop a plan for their ongoing governance and ensure compliance with the legislative requirements for running a community language school in this state. So I just announced that recently. The second priority will be to increase staffing at Community Languages Schools South Australia to provide intensive case management and curriculum development for new and existing community language schools for an initial 12 months. And the third element will be activity for the Community Language Schools of South Australia to deliver some of its face-to-face school personnel training workshops, teacher workshops and child safe workshops in the north of Adelaide. All training is currently provided at High Marsh Goodwood, relocating the training to the north of Adelaide to make it more accessible to a large proportion of community language staff. So that's just the start. So obviously I identified quite clearly there are many different areas that could be improved, and having a multicultural lens on this is looking at how we can support people. Now, we're talking about people who volunteer their time, often 40 weeks a year, giving that commitment. We think being bilingual is important. We think it's something that it's a start. That will be support. So I'm really looking forward to announcing further support, and that will be rolling out shortly.
Time for the examination of this section has now expired.